We're going to get started. My name is Greg Peterson, and I am the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and we're thrilled to host this extraordinary gathering of talent around the International Humanitarian Law Dialogues, which just happens to be our third annual. And we're just thrilled to have the opportunity to host it here at Chautauqua Institution. This doesn't happen without some really special sponsors who've made this all possible. And I'm going to have a real shout out to Syracuse University, and especially David Crane, who really is the mastermind behind all of this. So to David, thank you very much. The American Society of International Law, the Washington University School of Law, the Enough Project, Planet Hood Foundation, the Frederick Cox International Law Center from Case Western University School of Law, the International Law Girls, Chautauqua County, and we're also privileged, as I mentioned, to be part in this facility and to be at the Athenaeum Hotel, part of a very revered Chautauqua institution which has a storied history, but for our purposes, an extremely wonderful relationship with the Robert H. Jackson Center. I'm going to pause now and turn over the podium to Shara Babcock. Shara Babcock is Chautauqua Institution. There's a guy like Tom Becker who's the president, but it's really Shara Babcock to give us a word of welcome. Shara?
That's a unique introduction. Thank you. I do represent Chautauqua Institution. I'm Shara Babcock, and I serve Chautauqua as Director of the Department of Education. And I am thrilled to welcome you back for the third year. Chautauqua feels that this is a very important collaboration because the work that's done in humanitarian law is very important work. We, in many ways, cover many of the same subjects, sometimes broader and in less depth than you do in the law, but in a great depth in the 9 subjects that we choose each year. We're happy that you're here, and we hope that you have a wonderful experience and look forward to the great products of discussion that come out of this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Shara. There are many things unique about these conferences, but what is really unique is the opportunity to have in our midst the prosecutors, the folks who are actually taking the role of international law and practicing it right in the trenches themselves. And we're thrilled to have them in our midst. And let me just introduce them. The Deputy Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Fatou Bensouda. Fatou. I introduced him earlier, but let me be more formal about it. David Crane, who was the first Chief Prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone from April 2002 until July 15, 2005. Norman Farrell, who is the Deputy Prosecutor of the Tribunal for Yugoslavia. Norman Farrell. We have Joseph Camara. Joseph is the Deputy Prosecutor for the Special Court in Sierra Leone. We also have Alphonse Van, who is the Senior Trial Attorney from the Office of Prosecutor. So, Alphonse? By the way, shortly you'll see a gentleman, and I'll introduce him now, but we may pause and reflect and give him a hand when he comes in. Bill Kaming. Bill, age 90, and was a Nuremberg prosecutor during the subsequent trials case, the Ministries number 11. He gave us a spectacular presentation yesterday at the Robert Jackson Center. So joining us shortly will be Bill Kaming. We're now going to pause and reflect on the remembrance for Alison DeForge, and to present that, I will now call up the Executive Director and Executive Vice President of the American Society of International Law, Elizabeth Anderson.
Good morning. As we gather today to celebrate the role of women in international justice efforts, it is appropriate to pause momentarily to remember one woman who loomed very large in our field and whom we lost this past year. Alison DeForge was widely recognized as the leading expert on the Rwandan genocide. In the early 90s, she saw the danger brewing in the growing ethnic tension in the country and sounded the alarm. Unfortunately, her appeals fell on deaf ears. When genocide broke out, she worked tirelessly to press the international community to act, to halt the killing. And in the years following the genocide, she worked with her colleagues at Human Rights Watch to write the definitive account of the genocide entitled "Leave None to Tell the Story." The title was taken from a command that was overheard by a genocidaire during the violence. Alison did tell the story in her book, in testimony before expert panels of the United Nations and the African Union, and as an expert witness in 11 trials before the Rwanda Tribunal, as well as a number of proceedings in national courts. In 1999, the MacArthur Foundation recognized Alison's contributions with its Genius Award. Those of us who were fortunate enough to know and work with Alison could not help but be inspired by her. I came to know Alison when I was a young researcher with Human Rights Watch, working in its Brussels office, and she passed through frequently en route to and from Rwanda, to and from The Hague, or simply to visit her Rwandan refugee friends in Belgium, make sure that they were doing okay. Alison was a generous mentor and often took the young members of the staff out for dinner. And I would hang on her every word, whether it was about Rwanda or international politics or the way Washington works or about education or raising children. I would leave those dinners hoping that one day I might have a fraction of her wisdom and insight. She was astonishingly brave, a physically small woman, very beautiful, with silver hair and a twinkle in her eyes and a kindness about her face. She was a grandmother. But she was nonetheless a giant in our field, and she was unafraid to stand up to power, be it a heavily armed militiaman threatening her Rwandan colleagues at a checkpoint, or the most senior government officials. She believed fervently in the importance of truth-telling, of the pursuit of justice, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable that might be. When Continental Airlines Flight 3407 crashed near Buffalo last February and cut short her life, Alison was continuing to press for justice in Rwanda, not just for the genocidaires, but also for those who committed war crimes on the other side of the conflict. This position did not win her many friends, but that did not dissuade Alison. She worried that a one-sided accountability process would leave some of the story untold, and that it would sow the seeds of future instability and violence. She felt strongly that for justice to lay the groundwork for lasting peace, it must be fair. It must be applied even-handedly to all parties. It must go where the evidence takes us. Above all, Alison believed in making a difference. She believed that we all have an obligation to take our talents, our information, our creativity, and do what we can to make the world a better place. And so as we begin our dialogue, our telling of stories, horrific stories, difficult stories, but stories that must be told, I ask you to join me in a moment of silence to remember Alison Desforges and to recommit ourselves to the pursuit of justice and to making a difference with the wisdom, insight, bravery, and integrity that Alison modeled. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Professor John Q. Barrett, who's a professor of law at St. John's University in New York City, where he teaches constitutional law, criminal procedure, and legal history. John is also the Elizabeth S. Linney Fellow at the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown. John is no stranger to Chautauqua Institution, having spoken here several times. John is the foremost authority on Justice Robert H. Jackson, and we look forward to his biography, which I'm sure will be the seminal treatise on the subject. Also, if you have not become a participant in his listserv, it's remarkable, and he's able to take timely topics, match them up with the wisdom of Robert Jackson. You should make sure, I think we have a list floating around if you're interested. We're thrilled that he'll be talking on the subject of Katherine B. Fite. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just pause and introduce Bill Kaming.
Good morning, Greg. Thank you very much to Greg personally, the Robert Jackson Center, Chautauqua Institution, David Crane and Syracuse School of Law, the ASIL, and all the other co-sponsors. It's truly an honor to be in an august gathering like this and in the company of people who are dedicating their lives and their professional energy to the pursuit of justice globally. I need to thank Bill Kaming, a friend and an inspiration who personifies the Nuremberg generation which started this in the modern era. And my topic will connect to another aspect of that historical achievement, but it is a particular honor to be in Bill's presence and last night to have been in Bill's audience and classroom. I'll also point to the screen and thank and tell you a bit about three friends who were part of our gathering last year. On the right is Ben Ferenz, alive and well and fighting for international justice, particularly the definition and enforcement of the prohibition against aggressive war. In the center is our friend Whitney Harris, who I spoke to on Saturday at his home in St. Louis. Whitney just turned 97. He wanted to be with us today, but he's attending to some medical challenges, and he said to do two things: to tell his friends that he sends his regards, and to tell everyone, particularly his friends, that he's doing the best he can. And from Whitney Harris, the best has always been a very large measure of achievement, and so he's with us very much today. The third gentleman on the left is my justice's dear friend, Henry King. And Henry, of course, is with us spiritually, but can't be with us anymore in person. He was here last year and delivered a powerful address. His introduction said that he was in the autumn of his life and he didn't know maybe the late autumn. It turned out to be that case. It's a forceful memory and a powerful reminder, and I encourage you to click in YouTube and see video of Henry, and to read Henry, and to study and think about Henry's example. I'm also very pleased to report that I was handed this morning by Betsy Anderson the ASIL's brand new publication of last year's proceedings. I had the privilege of moderating a discussion among these three men, and it includes now in print Henry King's extremely powerful, what turned out to be valedictory address on this topic. I'm also following Elvis Costello. I just wanted to lighten things up a little bit. Elvis Costello performed in the amphitheater Saturday night, for those who were here, a brilliant musician of our age. Luckily, Bill Kaming has been an intervening presenter, because I thought I was right on the heels of Elvis, and that's a hard opening act. And it's not just a humor point, because Elvis Costello closed with his final encore with, of course, great music, but also a question that it struck me very powerfully as I was bopping a little bit, is sort of the point of what we do here. What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? Now, so far, and going forward, you'll notice a theme. This is the United States Congress being addressed by President Franklin Roosevelt in May of 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before U.S. involvement in World War II, seeking an enormous increase in defense appropriations to build the military preparedness of this country. And you'll see in this seated far left in the front row, Senator Harry Truman of Missouri, who of course comes to occupy a more important position. And you'll see arrayed across the front row the cabinet of President Roosevelt, including second from the right with his leg crossed right over left and his hands in his lap, Robert H. Jackson, who soon went on to the Supreme Court and then to be the chief American prosecutor at what became Nuremberg, appointed by that President Truman, who succeeded that President Roosevelt. The Nuremberg process deserves a moment or two of introduction, and so I wanted to set the stage. Many of you know it well, but Nuremberg is, for history, a completed project. In 1945 and through 1949, it was a brand new and fairly chaotic undertaking. The four victorious Allied powers had a general commitment to treat Nazi perpetrators of criminality, including the waging of aggressive war, as criminals and to bring them before legal processes. The ones who had committed crimes in particular locations were to be apprehended and tried in those locations. And the ones whose criminality spanned the European continent and had no particular location were to be tried through a new international process. This is London, August 8, 1945, and the gentleman on our left is a translator, and then the other four are the Soviet representative, Jan Nikitchenko, the British Chief Chancellor, Lord Jowett, Robert Jackson, and the French representative, Robert Falco. These gentlemen and their seconds and teams negotiated and worked out a process and an agreement during the summer of 1945 that created a new international court that defined crimes within the jurisdiction of the court, that set up procedures by which the court would conduct its proceedings, and then in relatively short order, an indictment was written and filed and a location was found, and that became the International Military Tribunal, a public justice proceeding of a new kind occurring in Nuremberg, beginning in November of 1945 and concluding on October 1st, 1946. That was the only international Nuremberg proceeding. Following the international trial, the alliance, in a sense, fractured. The United States and Britain decided they wished no further international proceedings, but the United States continued in its sector to prosecute cases at Nuremberg. There were 12 subsequent proceedings, American or U.S. tribunal proceedings, one of which, the last of which, the most complicated of which, was the Ministry's case that H.W. William Kaming prosecuted from 1947 through 1949. Jumping back to 1945, from London in August to Nuremberg in November, these are the judges, a principal judge and an assistant from each of the four nations. These are the American prosecutors at the table. You see Robert Jackson at the front right and Whitney Harris immediately behind him. Tom Dodd, who later became a United States Senator from Connecticut, is across from Jackson. Next to him or behind him is Sidney Alderman, John Harlan Amon, etc. around the table. At the top of the table is Jackson's own son, William, who was his father's executive assistant as a young lawyer at Nuremberg. And at the international trial, these were the 20 defendants in the box. Hermann Goering, defendant number 1 in the front corner, and Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Keitel, and etc. across the front row and the second row, including Albert Speer, who you see down towards the upper right. And at this point, I hope you have noticed something that is consistent in every slide I've shown you. Not one woman. Now that's good as to this slide. Congratulations to the women who didn't perpetrate Nazism. But as to the rest of this landscape and this architecture of international justice, by modern standards and even by contemporary standards, it was a man's world, and it was a man's show, and it was a man's undertaking. With one exception. Now there are others, and Diane Amon, the speaker who will follow me, will elaborate and develop this picture. But when I say there was one exception, I mean there was one principal woman, attorney, architect, participant from the beginning through the commencement and through the real accomplishment of the London negotiations and the International Military Tribunal proceeding at Nuremberg. Her name was Katherine Boardman Fite, F-I-T-E. And I dare say that before you read the program that contained her name, I'm willing to bet you each a quarter, I didn't carry them, so I hope I don't get wiped out on this, that you were not familiar with her name. Let me just run a quick chronology of her life. Born 1905 in Boston, so she's 40 years old at Nuremberg. Raised in Connecticut, a graduate of Vassar College, a graduate of Yale Law School, an attorney in private practice in New York City from 1930 to 1934, an attorney in Washington beginning in 1934 when she joined the staff of the General Claims Agency. Then later in the 30s, she joins the State Department and works in the Office of the Legal Advisor for the entirety of her career, becoming a high-ranking and expert treaty specialist in that office. From state, she is detailed to this project that becomes Nuremberg. She is single until she's 52 years old, when she marries a fellow named Francis French Lincoln, so she becomes Katherine B. Fite Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln was a State Department officer, an economist, a widower, and somewhat older than her. In 1962, she retired from the government. In 1968, Mr. Lincoln died. In her widowhood, she retired to Boston, where her sister lived. She attended regularly Nuremberg reunions of formal and informal qualities during her lifetime, and she died in 1989 at age 84. I particularly will focus on two friends here, because my guess is that Judge Patricia Wald, a graduate of the Yale Law School, like Katherine Fite, might not have been taught about this role model at the Yale Law School. And my guess is that my friend Michael Scharf, an alumnus of the Office of the Legal Advisor at the State Department, also might not have been raised in that environment with this relevant role model. And I think that is a big screw-up. So this talk and this introduction to the story of Katherine Fite and the fairly enormous article that I think will result from this, and that I'll be peddling around come February of next year, is a bit of a catch-up, and I hope something that restores a little bit of the fuller picture, although by no means a gender equality picture, of the age of Nuremberg. This was news at the time. July 11, 1945, the New York Times, admittedly on page 4, has a story headlined, "Woman Joins Staff of War Crimes Group." This was a novelty, and she was the first. Jackson had been appointed by Truman in late April. It was announced publicly in early May. He worked with a Washington staff and informally with departmental assistants from state and from war and other parts of the government, but had a small staff and moved to London with that staff in June, and then various additions came. Katherine Fite is part of a State Department addition to the Jackson staff in London in early July. The international negotiations had already commenced at that point, and she was given by the legal advisor at the State Department, Greer Hackworth, a leave or a detail of 3 to 4 months for her to serve as a consultant for the State Department on this project. Notice what was already underway in Jackson's hands, an enormous diplomatic undertaking that the State Department had completely failed to care about or staff or connect to. Robert Jackson had the assignment and the authority from the president to negotiate with the British, the Soviets, and the new French de Gaulle Republic of France, an international post-war legal landscape, and the authority from Truman to go it together if an agreement could be reached, or to blow it up if the other nations felt that the conditions that were essential in Jackson's view were unacceptable to them. That sounds at least a bit like State Department business, but it's a direct President to Jackson assignment, and the Secretary of State at the time, James Burns, had been briefly a Jackson colleague on the Supreme Court, was a close Jackson friend, and frankly, they all trusted and staffed Jackson. In the legal advisor's office, that was a topic of concern, and really what's going on with Katherine Fite's assignment was state lawyers, if not state management or the executive branch, caring a little bit about having some State Department there on the scene. When Katherine Fite arrives in London, it's still the last day before regular electricity service resumes in the city. So she arrives in bomb-damaged, swept and cleaned, but black at night when the sun set London. She's given an army billet in a hotel off of Grosvenor Square, the site of the American Embassy, the site of the OSS office space that was assigned to Jackson and his team, and she reports for duty. When she gets to the office, she's told to report to the Claridge Hotel, which is where Jackson was staying, in frankly a fairly palatial suite, much better than the office digs, and he'd sort of set up work quarters at Claridge's. And they hit it off from the get-go. Jackson's regard for Katherine Fite and Fite's regard for Justice Jackson is mutual and high, although I'll tell you in a bit that she also was somebody who had good, sharp, tart observations at times. She wasn't a hack or a sort of sycophant for Robert Jackson, but she was great legal talent, and so was he, and there was, I think, great professional esteem. Robert Jackson, by the way, was one of 9 men on the Supreme Court, an employer of only male law clerks, the head of this only male lawyer staff, etc., a devoted father of the son William and a daughter and a husband, and a person who certainly knew there were 2 genders in the world, but in a close working relationship, Katherine Fite was, as best I can document, the first senior woman lawyer near peer in Robert Jackson's career. And I think you can sort of plot other women and more significance in Jackson's later years. I think part of that is Katherine Fite's achievement. Her trip and her arrival and her introduction to Jackson quickly becomes a responsibility that plugs her into the work of the negotiation. It was ongoing. It was meeting in the church house, which is adjacent to Westminster Abbey, in a room that had a big square 4-sided table, 4 seats on a side, so Jackson and a stenographer and an assistant or 2, and a Soviet side and a British side and a French side. And they were trying to explain across language divides and conceptual divides each other's legal systems and what, in Jackson's view, needed to be the fairness and the procedure that would suffice for American standards of due process. This is explaining to the Soviets that a trial isn't a ritual before the execution, but instead something that is based on a belief that someone is a criminal, a belief that one can carry a burden of proof, and then a fair adversary process at which somebody has the resources and the counsel and the right to defend themselves, and that it could take time, and that it involves expenditure, and that it will occur in public, etc. The drafting of crimes is also going on. And what Katherine Fite is doing is sometimes sitting in the meetings, more often working in office space or in her own billet, drafting new languages for these different provisions. What's going to count as the crime of breach of peace or aggressive war, crimes against humanity, war crimes, the conspiracy count, the procedural architecture that's part of the Tribunal Charter. And it's a little hard, it's hard across the whole of Nuremberg, to draw an organization chart that exactly ranks people. We can say, obviously, that Jackson is the top American dog, and during this London phase, Cindy Alderman is the number 2, and then it kind of flattens out and gets messy. But Fite is a go-to next-level person, and if she's not the number 3, she's among the number 3s that Jackson and Alderman lean on for her legal skills. She also brings to this a historical and professional knowledge from the legal advisor's office of diplomacy, diplomatic history, treaty drafting, and actual treaty negotiations. as you may know, a backbone of the aggressive war charge, the answer to the claim that this is an ex post facto invention, is the Kellogg-Briand Pact, is treaty commitments that the United States and Germany and other nations had been part of. Katherine Fite brings historical and legal knowledge and is part of developing that argument. During the London phase, in addition to this work in London, there's also traveling. And when we talk about Nuremberg as a man's show, my yes and no answer is all in this photograph, because this is the A-team. Now, a slight exception. The Soviets refused to go on this trip. The Soviet team in London was really a puppet being controlled by Moscow, and Jackson invited everybody on his plane to come see the proposed courthouse location in Nuremberg. The Soviets that morning canceled out. But this is the American and the British and the French as they land in the airfield in Fite, Germany, outside of Nuremberg, on July 21, 1945. This is the look-see scouting visit. And you can look across that picture. You see Jackson to the right of center in front of the tall British prosecutor, Khaki Roberts. Next to Jackson in the light suit is Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, the British Attorney General. In the left of center, you see Robert Falco, the French representative. On the far left, you see some of the other Americans, Frank Shea and Sidney Alderman. You see a whole bunch of guys. And I don't have a laser pointer, but under the airplane seal, you see one lawyer wearing a skirt. That's Katherine B. Fite. Katherine Fite comes with Jackson on this trip and on almost every serious mission that Jackson undertook thereafter that involved travel and negotiation. The stops include not just Nuremberg, but shortly after this trip, another trip from London to Germany to go to the Potsdam Conference. Potsdam in the southwest suburbs ringing Berlin, where the big three, Churchill and Stalin and Truman, and then as Churchill finds out he's lost the election, he's replaced by Attlee, are having their first summit meeting. And their conversations in Sicilienhof and the Potsdam Accord includes a commitment to this international trial, the thing that Jackson's busy negotiating in London. Well, it involves Jackson coming to report to Truman and to Burns and to McCloy and et cetera. And the person he brings with him as his lawyer on that trip is Katherine Fite. They make a side trip from Potsdam. It involves going through some harrowing Russian checkpoints into the heart of Berlin, which is a Soviet-controlled area, and a visit to Hitler's Reichschancellery. And I'm going to, here and in a few other places, read you Katherine Fite's description of that stop. Like so many of these people, Katherine Fite wrote beautiful letters. This was an age of letter writing, and these were graphically skilled composers, articulate, wonderful writers, and a lot of this has survived. Frankly, it's a huge gap in the existing Nuremberg literature. There's great Nuremberg historiography, but few have done the digging into the present impression recorded letters, and I am. So one of my pleasures has been Katherine Fite's letters, located in various places, some private. And this is what she wrote from London, returned from Berlin, to her parents in Poughkeepsie, New York, on July 27. One thing I skipped above is Hitler's Reichschancellery, which was obviously a magnificent building, now largely in ruins, though the first floor rooms remain. Saw Hitler's magnificent office, with desks just dumped over in a heap with all the other rubbish, got rooting around in debris, and discovered personal letters and office notes, etc. This not in Hitler's room, in outer office. Why, I said, a historian would go crazy. I had first started looking for souvenirs, printed documents, etc. I quickly discarded that for original documents in the rubbish. I turned up written notes, personal letters of some sort to an SS guard from his father, who knew the Fuhrer was keeping the son safe. I shall have them translated in the morning, some larger books with lists of names. We were all in after the Soviet zone in a building guarded by Soviets, so we had to be quick. There were literally yards and yards of movie film just kicking around. Mr. Fay, this is Charles Fay, later Judge Fay of the D.C. Circuit, who at this point is the legal advisor to General Lucius Clay in Berlin and is also an instrumental actor in this story that becomes Nuremberg. Mr. Fay got interested and was going to see what could be done to have someone go in and sift the rubbish out if we could get past the Russians. I suppose any actual documents in any quantity are already in Moscow. Lots of unused metals were found in the building. Legal tender to the Soviet guards is just cigarettes. I have a German mother's medal with a swastika, and a picture was taken of the justice presenting it to me. In other words, a bit of a gag photo of Jackson pinning a mother's swastika medal on Katherine Fite. I regret that so far I haven't found that photograph. The Potsdam authorization becomes the Jackson 11th hour brinksmanship, which results in the London Agreement. The August 8th photograph I showed you earlier is the signing. To be fair, Katherine Fite was just off camera. She was in the room when that agreement was reached. She also was part of trips during this London phase with Jackson to Frankfurt, which was the seat of the American occupation and where he coordinated military matters with Generals Eisenhower and Betz and others. One of the senior legal advisors on that Betz staff, the U.S. occupation government staff in Frankfurt, is a figure in American constitutional law named Charles Fairman, a professor at Stanford Law School, a great and accomplished scholar now gone. He'd been in the JAG Corps and a legal thinker, and he meets Jackson and he's introduced to State Department lawyer Katherine Fite. Political scientist Fairman immediately says, "Are you related to Emerson Fite, the great political scientist at Vassar College, formerly at Yale, Harvard, etc.?" And she says, "That's my dad." So the sort of web and the roles of this Nuremberg generation is very thick. They leave London, their work done, and decamp to Nuremberg on September 10th in Katherine Fite's case. She takes up residence in the Grand Hotel, badly damaged but rebuilt by this point to some degree. She does not get a house requisitioned from Germans in the suburbs the way the men did. There were no other women of rank for her to bunk with, so she's staying in the hotel as if she's a temp. But she's not staying in the adjacent building, which was known informally as Girls' Town, which is where the secretaries, the stenographers, etc., lived in something of a parietal, supervised, but not very effectively, gender segregation. She had her own room, which became a suite, which became kind of a working office in the Grand Hotel, and that was hers for the duration of her stay. She is exposed to the wreckage of Germany, particularly in Nuremberg, to encounters with German people who she views with hostility, at least in adults. She makes trips in Germany from undamaged, beautiful cities to the wreckage in the area surrounding Nuremberg, a side trip to Dachau, like many who were part of this staff, to see what a concentration camp was. That was both extremely powerful and I think a little bit, in the end, counterproductive, because a mindset took among Jackson and his staff who had visited Dachau, which is relatively close to Nuremberg, that was a concentration camp. And that meant that every concentration camp was like Dachau. Of course, what took them the span of the trial to understand was that concentration camps and killings and horrible suffering there were of a different order than the extermination camps that existed in the East and that were the apparatus of the Holocaust. They eventually begin to get it. But it takes really the whole year for them to understand the enormity of what they're dealing with. Katherine Fite is part of building the case. She's not an experienced prosecutor or trial lawyer, but she's a very smart lawyer, and she identifies people who need to be interrogated before the indictment and sits in and, I think, ghostwrites questions for the interrogators to feed to people like Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, the Secretary of State equivalent, who's a prospective defendant, and Keitel and Frick and Goering and others. She travels with Jackson to Berlin in October and is present when the indictment is assigned and is really the counsel who's there with him for that purpose. And she's part of the division of labor and the mad scrambling in October into November to prepare for trial. As you know, Jackson's decision was to try this as a case on captured documents, including in the end some of the stuff that she had scooped up off the floor of the Reichschancellery back in August. Some of those things become exhibits in the trial. And what the procedures permitted was a form of presentation called trial briefs, self-proving summary documents on top of authenticated records. And so the Jackson staff is divided into brief writing teams under supervision that in the end was somewhat ineffective. and in different groupings that varied in their talent. I dare say that two of the giants of this trial brief writing process produced the brief on the Reich Cabinet, which was one of the indicted organizations ultimately convicted and what Ribbentrop and others, Goering, were a part of. And those two were Justice Benjamin Kaplan of later the Harvard Law School faculty and the Supreme Judicial Court in the state of Massachusetts, and still with us, the senior early Nuremberg lawyer, and Katherine Fite. And that's her crunch project. Now, as she comments in a later letter to her parents, that work product then got handed to this supervisory lawyer who she was none too impressed by, who actually presented it, who read it to the tribunal in December of 1945. This is Fite's comment in another letter on a diplomatic angle. This is her comment in October to her parents, again, privately, on how Jackson, at that moment, at the signing of the indictment, was negotiating. And I think you see the difference between a seasoned State Department type versus an amateur, maybe, a fake diplomat, and somebody who had a bit of a temper and was in a hurry, and of course was AWOL from his job and in a hurry to get back. I think the justice has made a mistake by giving the newspapers to understand that only the United States means business. I get the impression that the other three have now ganged up to put the heat on us and maybe rush us through. At any rate, I think the justice has most unnecessarily given offense to the other countries. In many ways, I've been sorry not to have been there to stop some of this. In other ways, I am glad I wasn't in the room for some of these moments. He is an able man, but predominantly a politician, and not a strong man in terms of organization or diplomacy. The organization has suffered for the lack of a strong guiding hand. We're rushing the indictment. We don't have a thorough case behind such a historical document. I know of at least one historical misstatement, which I brought to the attention of 4 people, and it's still in there. Careless work, office politics. Then some time ago, I found a very serious error in punctuation in the signed charter, which was, of all places, in the section on crimes against humanity, i.e. the Jews, and quite changed the sense of the charge. This is well known to legal aficionados. This is the comma problem of the London Agreement. Katherine Fite is the lawyer who spots it, and it's addressed with a Band-Aid, but a lot of historical damage, I think, flows from needing to use that Band-Aid rather than getting it right in the first place. So you see, it's all not a glorious, joyous crusade. And, by the way, I think Judge Biddle is a very weak appointment. The trial starts on November 20th. Jackson's majestic opening statement occurs on November 21st. The American case comes first, and the reading of these trial briefs in the summary presentation carries through the next couple of weeks. The Kaplan-Fite case against the Reich Cabinet is presented in early December, and she's up against her time commitment, 3 to 4 months, and heat from the legal advisor to get back. She had cabled about extensions and was told, come back when you're supposed to, or just stay for the whole damn thing. And reading between the lines, she had a sense that for her advancement in position at the State Department, the better path was to come home at the end of the commitment rather than to stay for the whole damn thing. And so she does that, leaving at the Christmas break, traveling home out of Nuremberg before Christmas and home to the U.S. in early January. It's a loss of talent, and she's part of a loss of talent, that I think adversely affected the American effort and generally the international military tribunal process. Jackson lost a lot of his A-team at the end of 1945. Some of the people in top positions weren't A-team, and some of the successors to those vacancies were A-team. So it's not a uniform broad brush I can paint with here. But some of the people who were on American soil in 1946, Katherine Fite, Ben Kaplan, Sidney Kaplan, Gordon Dean, quite a few others I could list, would have been very important assets to still have in Nuremberg for the rest of that trial. Now, circling back to our topic, Katherine Fite on gender. These letters to her parents are filled, and other documents are filled with some wonderful riches. One of the things she touches on is the experience of being the token woman. And I'll read you just a few samples from different points in time. July 23, this is during the London phase.
Justice Jackson is a grand person, very simple, very witty, very kind, very thoughtful, and a very heavy load on his shoulders. He has arranged for some of us to hear a case in the House of Lords tomorrow, though the attorney, through the attorney, as the British say, I suppose. I believe I am to be included by virtue of my being female and perhaps also my State Department status. It makes it a bit embarrassing to be included when my Army colleagues with whom I work much of the time are not, but they don't seem to begrudge it to me. She writes in August, after the London negotiations are done, but while she's still there. Being the only woman on the staff has many drawbacks, but from the social point of view, it pays. A masculine society is eager for women. And think about an army, a war. This is an all-male army. It's still an occupation army. Any woman is a change of scenery. A masculine society is eager for women, and we have the added advantage of being in civilian clothes. Though when we go into Germany for the trial, we Army have to get into uniform to be more easily identified with assimilated rank. The Army will pay for the uniforms, otherwise too expensive for me. My Army colleagues, I am sure, are jealous of my trip, for I do go to places and travel in high circles, but they're very gallant about it. At least I'm seeing how the top side fares in military occupation. In other words, the VIP quarters, the transportation, the private plane, the plush meals. November 11th, the eve of trial, she writes to her parents, I started out to tell you of the Justice's cocktail party for Senator Claude Pepper yesterday. Pepper visiting Nuremberg. Very pleasant. Then I'm in on a smaller party and to dinner at the hotel in our nightclub, which is the center of our local life. Sat next to Senator Pepper, who regaled the party with tales of his visit to King Ibn Saud and his tent city. The biggest event of the king's life was his visit on FDR's battleship. They had to pull all the women off the ship before that one, including Anna. The senator looks like Adolph Burley, another New Dealer. He does not like Mr. Hackworth. Lots of people don't. That's the legal advisor. Tonight, another VIP dinner at the Justice's home for the senator. Long dresses. You see, the panel of eligible women for such parties is small. So I always get there and usually get the seat of honor. It's fun and also an effort when you're tired, as I am today. Think of the old line about Ginger Rogers. She had to do everything Fred Astaire did, backwards wearing high heels. There's some quality of that to Katherine Fite being invited as the leading female to all these social obligations. After Nuremberg, returning to the State Department, she has a long and distinguished career. She writes for the State Department the summary of the Nuremberg judgment, which is published officially by the State Department and is an important document. She stays in close touch with Jackson in Washington, both as the publication of Nuremberg records and results is occurring over those next 4 or 5 years, and supplying him information through State Department channels on the subsequent proceedings under Telford Taylor, William Kaming, and so forth, and in social gatherings, including some of the reunions that I mentioned earlier. She is the kind of talent whose gender I hope today would not be noticed. I hope she would be like the women among us in the field of international justice, high-level accomplished women, but indistinguishable as a gender matter. It wasn't so at the time. This is a Christmas party shortly before her departure at Jackson's home, occupied from a German family. And you see Jackson and his secretary and his son sitting in the front row. And you see 3 secretaries in the next row. And you see Katherine Fite kind of clustered behind with the tree branch in her right ear. This was taken on the same evening. You see General Robert Gill, Jackson's executive officer, kind of playing a little handsy with one of the secretaries. It's, I'm sure, just a gallant hand through the arm. Katherine Fite's got her hands to herself. And I think it's a picture that, and the other secretary, who also is a lovely woman, has her chair separated from all of this General Gill stuff. She's told me that Gill was a friendly fellow. This is really Katherine Fite. This is her and Jackson working on his desk in his office at the Palace of Justice. Okay, it is a posed photograph. Jackson took these with many, many staff members as they finished their work, and it was a souvenir for them. But I think this sort of partnership is the model of modern international justice, men and women together in these complicated endeavors, and at least to this minimal, personalized extent, I hope for equality, it's a relief to discover that there was this much of it at Nuremberg. I'll close by making a twinkling comment about Robert H. Jackson. He was a man of his time. He had his, I think, preconceptions, even prejudices. And he also was a bit paternal, probably in a little bit of a lightly sexist way towards women. 1940s gallantry probably bordered on that. You see it in some of his letters, referring to the men and the girls and other things. He was the father of one of each, and his son's there as his executive assistant and a lawyer, and his daughter, an equally brilliant person, was not somebody who he steered towards law school or aspired for a professional career in the same way, although she was certainly brilliant enough to be at the top of that stuff. Now, that's the 1940s. You also see it in one little document that I love. Katherine Fite, in her letters to her parents, signs by what I take to be a family nickname. She signs herself as Titter, Titter. And I suppose that her younger sister might have been Tatter or Twitter or, something. And we've all got family nicknames. She's Miss Fite, Counsel Fite, Major Assimilated Rank Fite on all memoranda, and in almost all Jackson correspondence. But there's one occasion where Jackson writes a little chit and sends it to her, and he signs it with a J for Justice or Jackson, but he addresses it to Katie. And I'm not sure anybody ever got away with calling her Katie. I've seen no trace of it in any of the family correspondence, but I'm confident that given the regard that ran in two directions, she probably took it and smiled and regarded him well, even if he was a little too Katie-ish with her now and then. So that's the story of Katherine B. Fite, and I look forward to, in publication, telling you much more about it, and I hope in time that her role gets a lot more recognition, because she wholly and certainly deserves it. Thank you very much.